So hi everyone, welcome to the meeting. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to be talking to you about the intersection of climate justice and migrant justice, and there'll be opportunities to hear from you as well, which I'm really looking forward to. So the meeting should last for about an hour and a half. And there'll be breakout groups later on in the meeting and opportunities to ask questions and hear from everybody. And we're going to start with a presentation that covers the whole spectrum of discussion points around this issue. So we're in a new context because we have a new government. So, we still have climate breakdown, which has been, not changing, unfortunately. And, the climate is displacing people, but also sometimes there can be too much emphasis on migration being a bad thing. And this idea of sort of floods of displaced people, which can stoke fear. So we need to be really careful and really intentional in how we talk about this with a climate lens. In addition to this, we've seen race riots this summer, and they've come at the end of a campaign of stoking up hatred and division from the far right and from the previous Tory government, who had a lot of schemes that were designed to really get a lot of media attention and stoke up division in our communities. Since the election, we have a Labour government, and Labour have a different take on this issue. So rather than sort of noisily failing on their own terms, as the Tories have, where they've had these big flagship policies that just haven't worked on their own terms, so deporting people to Rwanda or the Bibi Stockholm barge, what Labour have done is committed to deporting more people than the Tories. They've already deported hundreds of people, and we've seen planes taking off. They've increased the number of spaces in detention centres, and have vowed to be very brutal on migration. But they're not doing it in a way that really is galvanizing a lot of attention. So they're doing it quietly. So they're sort of succeeding on their own terms quietly rather than failing loudly like the Tories, which in some ways can be more difficult to tackle. So it's a really important time to be talking about border violence, and it's really relevant to our context here in the UK.
So first of all, we're going to sort of connect the issues. So we'll run through some key elements of climate justice and of migrant justice and the way the two intersect. And then we're going to focus on communicating about climate and migration, it's both the intersecting issues and also this idea of climate linked migration and how we can do it positively and effectively to disrupt some of those far right narratives and dangerous narratives. Then we're going to have a break, and we'll move to the sort of more practical side, around solidarity and the kind of actions we can all take together to push for kind of climate and migrant justice. And then at the end, we're going to do some breakout discussions, really hearing from you all about what kind of solidarity can be done locally and what are the barriers and what are the opportunities and that kind of thing. So it should be super exciting. Wonderful. All right. So my name is Nick. I'm the Migrant Justice Coordinator for the Climate Justice Coalition. I work pretty much solely on strengthening the connections between climate and migrant justice, which is obviously what today is all about. But it's really important to say that this kind of intersectional work between the two movements is really being done collaboratively, with a kind of collective of groups from both movements who are kind of working on the joint issues. We've called it the Climate and Migrant Justice Organizing Group, or the CMJ, just to add acronyms to people's lives. And it's kind of made up of groups like Migrants Organize, JCWI, Tipping Point, Racial Justice Network. And we've been working over the last year to do kind of organizing projects and also some education and workshops like this, and some kind of joint action stuff, but it's still very much in development, I would say. Let's work at the intersection, as we've seen from the local level as well. You know, there's loads of amazing stuff happening in different communities, connecting the issues, trying to build that up to the kind of national and international levels, and like build this kind of really powerful movement of movements. But yeah, so before we get to the kind of intersecting issues, I'm just going to take us briefly through some key aspects of climate justice. I understand that this is not going to be new content for many people in this workshop, but the idea is just kind of highlight some of the key foundations climate justice on like an international level that helps like set up the connections and the intersections with migrant justice, both globally but also like here in the UK. So at the heart of climate justice is the understanding that climate change is a political and an economic problem and not purely an environmental or ecological one. Mary Robinson, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has described it as probably the greatest human rights challenge of the 21st century. These two images on the screen, it's maybe a bit crude, but it kind of illustrates how in the 90s, when the kind of awareness of climate breakdown was growing, it was often understood and framed, like certainly here in the UK, as like largely an environmental issue. But in countries in the global south, low-income communities globally that were already experiencing the impacts of climate change, it was very much about poverty, about inequality, and about the kind of development issues between the global north and the global south. So, for example, um, sorry. For example, there's been recently we've seen devastating floods in Pakistan that have severely impacted farmers, peasant communities, kind of landless, and that's often led to kind of forced displacement, both within Pakistan and across the borders outside of it. But these groups who have heavily rely on agriculture for their livelihood, already bear the brunt of climate breakdown and are denied compensation, like despite the commitments to loss and damage on the global stage, for example, at multilateral conferences like COP26. So as we know, in reality, these two issues like can't be separated. Climate justice means that climate change isn't, or climate breakdown, sorry, isn't framed about just saving polar bears and of being of concern to kind of like middle class environmentalists. It's connected to the poverty, inequality, and justice movements in the UK and around the world. So, what drives climate change is that, what drives climate justice is that climate breakdown is disproportionately affecting the lives of people and countries least responsible for causing it. Those are also the people who have the least resources to meet the challenge. And these people will experience further poverty and damage if the policies that we pursue to address climate breakdown don't take a justice-centered approach. A clear example of this at the moment is the kind of stripping of indigenous land to mine critical minerals for the electric vehicles markets, or as we're going to come to extensively, the militarization of borders as a way to control the impacts of climate breakdown. On a more local level, we see time and time again in this country that it's kind of poorer, racialized communities, marginalized communities that are most affected by kind of local climate issues, whether that's pollution or extreme weather, and so on. And this, like really importantly, this kind of injustice is only going to deepen as the climate crisis intensifies. I don't know if you saw there's this recent research from York University that's documented like nitrogen oxide, like local car emissions across the UK, and it's like consistently, typically, the most deprived groups of society that live in locations with the highest emissions. Similarly, sorry, we're already seeing like poorer coastal communities, for example, in Norfolk, that are already being impacted by coastal erosion as a result of climate breakdown. These communities are like routinely not able to access adequate support from local councils to help deal with this damage. So it's really, really clear, right, that the climate movement here must like center issues of justice and inequality in all of its work. Platforming voices and taking the lead from those on the front lines of climate breakdown and oppression globally, but also building solidarity and strengthening communities here with the kind of intersectional movements that we see at the local levels. So to understand why those who are least responsible are impacted the most and have the least financial resources, tech, and political freedoms to address climate breakdown, we need to take like a historical view. So the global picture of wealth today between kind of large industrialized global north countries and those in the global south largely reflects the financial gains that UK, Europe, America, etc., were able to make through colonialism and through imperialism, extracting fossil fuels, labor and resources and other natural resources to fuel rapid, large-scale economic growth. So in effect, these countries have kind of reaped the benefits of exploiting those natural resources and those people, and it's put them in a position of huge political and economic power. And it's these asymmetries of power that are not only behind climate change, but also the poverty and inequality that we see across the world. And that power has been used to create systems that we see in the form of international debt policies, unfair global tax systems, illicit capital flows, which have taken much needed money away from poorer countries and prevented them from investing in essential infrastructure, public services, health system, and social protection measures, leaving those countries unable to protect the lives and livelihoods of their citizens. When it comes to decisions being made about how to tackle climate breakdown, these exact same asymmetries of power are at play. A good example of this comes from Mitzi Janelle Tan, who is an international climate justice activist who I think is speaking on a tour of the UK at the moment with Global Justice Now. She spoke really powerfully about this at a public event we did on these issues earlier in the year, like describing the effects of climate breakdown on our home country in the Philippines, where kind of floods and severe weather events are wrecking communities, forcing people to move from the countryside into the cities and into other countries for work and for a safer life. But like the kind of main point that Mitzi was making was that the Philippines doesn't have adequate resources or infrastructure to adapt to these impacts and protect its communities and their lives and livelihoods, precisely because of the kind of global inequalities of wealth and power that have created this kind of extractive systems which have driven climate breakdown. So whilst wealthier nations carry on polluting to this day and refuse to pay their fair share for the damage they've caused, and the effects of climate breakdown are growing, and as are the costs of adapting to a heating world. Communities across the global south, like as many of you well know, call consistently for climate finance, for loss and damage, for resources to mitigate against and adapt to the impacts of climate breakdown, as well as compensation for what they've already lost. So this kind of like resourcing or whatever, there's lots of different mechanisms, lots of different ways of categorizing it. But I think I always come back to these like three kind of principles. So that the rich polluting nations and corporations must immediately kind of stop the harm they're doing. They must repair the harm they've caused, and they must compensate for the harm that cannot be repaired. At the intersection of climate and migrant justice, these kind of principles would come under the core principle of the right to stay, which is to defend those who have done the least to cause climate change globally from its deepening impacts. Its counterpart is the right to move safely and with dignity when this is not possible. And these kind of two principles are at the core of the intersection between climate and migrant justice, which Rosanna is going to speak to now.
So yeah, I'm Rosanna. I work at Tipping Point, and yeah, I do a lot of work with climate justice and migrant justice. And yeah, I'm just going to talk a bit more about how these two are linked. Um, Firstly, yeah, just want to say that the systems that have created the climate crisis are the same systems that are behind the violent border regime we have today, and would name these systems as capitalism and colonialism. And so, yeah, I just want to talk a bit about what exactly are borders. What is the border regime? So, yeah, border can be just seen as a real or an artificial line that separates geographic areas. But essentially, borders are political boundaries. And what this means in reality, how does the border regime like manifest in day-to-day life? It looks like detention centers, deportation flights, the sea becomes a border, the inability to reach a country safely and fairly. Yeah, those are borders that stop that. So in the UK, we have quite a few detention centres, and they are essentially like prisons. It's where people will go if they're waiting for deportation. Sometimes people are just taken to detention centres and then brought back into the community, and it sometimes seems quite arbitrary, the way that the government treats them. The UK is also the only country in Europe to not have a limit on immigration detention, so people can get taken to immigration detention and have no idea when they're going to leave. Also, the UK border is at the French border as well. The UK government pays French police, the French, yeah, essentially gives money to the French government to secure their border there. It means violence in Calais and Dunkirk, where people are beaten up regularly and tear gassed, and yeah, just means that it's very hard for them to come to the UK. The border regime also consists of the hostile environment, which maybe, yeah, you guys have heard of. And these like policies mostly started with Theresa May, I think when she was Home Secretary in 2012. And this hostile environment meant that borders became internal and anyone could become a border guard essentially. On the NHS, they were getting like doctors and nurses to check people's passports. Landlords became border guards. They had to start checking people's passports if people wanted to rent homes. There was also schools where you have teachers in schools. They tried to turn them into border guards and tried to get them to check children's passports. But there was a successful campaign a few years ago to stop this practice. So yeah, campaigning does work. So yeah, why like what are borders, and what they do essentially is that they don't stop people from moving. They just make it more dangerous for people to move. Yeah, people will move if wherever they are is not safe for them. And yeah, I think this line from a Warsan Shire she's a poet, a British Somalian poet. She says that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than land. And yeah, we can see how dangerous borders can be, how dangerous the sea can become because of policies. This year alone, 1,500 people have drowned in the Mediterranean, and 2024 has become the deadliest year for migrant crossings on the English Channel. Yeah, 52 people have already died this year, and I think it was yeah, a few weeks ago there was 4 deaths reported. So borders essentially create this kind of global apartheid, where yeah, the people from global south aren't able to move to the global north. It's a split that protects capital, it protects money, and it keeps the global south in a subordinate position. Some people will say this kind of dream of like having no borders is a pipe dream, but really we can see that borders already don't exist for money. Multinationals can go anywhere in the world, can set up and extract resources from different countries, mostly from the global south, and they can exploit cheap labor there. So yeah, really, borders just exist to keep the poorer people out from richer nations. And freedom of movement is politically determined and racially determined. We can see that there are stronger passports. This is mostly global north passports. You can, if you have a global north passport, you can go most places in the world. You can also like live in most places in the world. Yeah, without too much difficulty. So when we say we are fighting for migrant justice, this means that we are fighting the root causes of the violent border regime. Yeah, mostly the systems of capitalism and colonialism. It means climate justice means building solidarity for those who are affected by the border regime. It means fighting for safety, dignity, and respect for all migrants, and fighting for freedom of movement for all. In the UK, there are many migrant justice campaigns, and there's a lot of campaigning going on by many different people. And these campaigns are there to like shut down detention centres, and also support people inside detention centres, because this day-to-day solidarity is really important. One group in London, they're called Solidarity Detainee Support. They used to be called SOAS Detainee Support. I've supported people through them as well. If you live in London and you want to support people, I do suggest checking them out. I think hopefully someone's putting that in the chat. There's also in Sheffield, there's a group called VIDI. I think it stands for Voice of Voiceless Immigration Detainees. And that is made up of people who experience the border regime, but they have loads of campaigns, and please support them if you live around Sheffield. Migrant justice campaigning has been successful in some ways. With like the Rwanda policy, didn't end up going ahead. There was also direct action to stop people getting onto Rwanda flights, and a lot of climate activists got involved in that. Migrant justice means fighting for better accommodation for asylum seekers. There's a group based in Coventry called CARAG, and they work on that. So please check them out as well. And then also, just generally the hostile environment, the policies that mean that the border is in the NHS. There are people campaigning against that. There's patients, not passports. And I think they are based in most places in the UK. So please check them out as well. So I'm just going to go a bit deeper into the link between migration and the climate crisis. So as the climate crisis worsens, and we can see the impacts on people in marginalized communities become more severe. This means that people may be forced to leave their homes. But at the same time, the countries that they're forced to leave, they're not able to adapt to the disasters because of the legacy of colonialism and extractive capitalism. This means that there is an infrastructure there to deal with these crises. The economy isn't resilient enough to protect the lives and livelihoods of people. And also, this is because of exploitation by rich nations and corporations, which have actually profited from this climate breakdown. So people who leave their homes for work or for a safer, better life are often met with racist and violent border policies in the global north. And these policies are designed to protect the resources of the global north while providing them with cheap labor to exploit. And so this exploitation of people and planet for profit are the two sides of the same coin. We see an extractivist capitalist system that will drain every last drop of oil and wreck the earth for the benefit of the few. And this same system relies on perpetual inequality and the violent border regime to function. It, as I said before, relies on the free movement of capital and not of people. So this term climate-linked migration sometimes is used for people leaving their home due to floods, but it is a challenging and debated concept. Climate refugee does not have formal status in international law, and it also hides the complexity of human mobility. We don't know when climate breakdown does happen. Yeah, it's not going to just be disasters people are fleeing from. It will be like civil wars and yeah, other reasons like that. So this connection between climate and migrant justice is much deeper than the categorization of climate-linked migration. As more people move due to climate breakdown, we'll see probably governments in the global north increase their border controls, their walls, and their surveillance as a way to control the impacts of this crisis. And they'll call this a solution to the crisis that they have caused. This securitization of the climate crisis prevents meaningful action on climate breakdown. It threatens and dehumanizes people who move. And these are people who have typically done the least to cause the crisis. Billions are already spent on militarizing the borders, much more than climate finance. Yeah, this money is given to arms companies and corporations that profit from the horror that they create. This money could be spent on loss and damage and reparations to protect communities globally, but it's not. It's spent on securitization. And the securitization of climate crisis is fed by an alarmist narrative about future climate migration, which Sasha will talk about in a bit. So yeah, and we've got this quote here. So the world's biggest polluting countries are spending on average 2.3 times as much arming their borders than they are on climate finance. We can see banks like banks like BlackRock and Vanguard, who make billions from funding fossil fuel projects that wreck the planet. And at the same time, they're going to be making a lot of money from the border and surveillance industry that depends on climate breakdown and racist government policy for its profit. Yeah, and so essentially migration can be seen as a form of climate reparations. If it's the people who have contributed to the least of the climate crisis that are the most most affected by it, then they should be able to move to safety, especially to the countries that have contributed the most to the climate crisis.
In the face of these kind of like intersecting issues, we've really seen over the last few years is that climate and migrant groups are really coming together to support each other and to build solidarity and to fight these overlapping injustices together. The aim of our work, the work of the Climate Migrant Justice Organising Group and many of the different groups involved in that, at the intersection, is to facilitate these connections kind of locally in communities and also across organisations and internationally with activists all over the world. The aim is to kind of help groups connect and share skills, resources, tactics, and to really like strengthen each other's fights and strengthen each other's causes. Like as a movement of movements working together, we can develop kind of joint campaigns, intersecting demands and collaborative action to push for this kind of meaningful change. We're really fundamentally organizing around these two core principles. So the right to stay, which is from climate breakdown, and the right to move safely and with dignity when staying isn't possible or even desirable. I guess in this work, it's really important to kind of acknowledge, keep present the climate movements, some of the climate movements' role kind of historically and presently in perpetuating kind of harmful narratives and practices that have undermined migrant and racial justice, as well as kind of addressing the resource inequality between especially larger kind of NGOs and like more grassroots frontline groups. By as we sort of said, like this is really changing, and we've really seen a change over the last few years. The central tenet of climate justice is to be led by and to support those kind of most affected by both climate breakdown and oppression globally, which of course includes migrant groups and racialized groups and the fight for migrants' rights. It's like we need to be really clear, I think, like this is not about like charity for a specific category of climate refugee or whatever. It's about solidarity with migrants and migrant organizations like of all kinds. I think like fundamentally the point here is that global inequality, climate crisis, racist border policies, they share the same root causes and they share the same solutions. And this is a fight that the climate migrant justice movements will win, but we will only win it together.
So my name is Sasha Haddad, and I am from No Borders in Climate Justice, a collective of migrant and climate justice activists working on the intersection of climate and migration. So today I'm going to talk to you about dangerous narratives and how to talk about climate and migration. All right, so first of all, let's get started by having a look at these headlines on the screen. And let's have a little look at some of the harmful language being used in the headlines. So we can see phrases like mass migration, unprecedented migration, waves of migration. These headlines dominate the discourse on climate and migration, both in the news and online. So in 2022, more than 1 in 10 tweets on climate and migration used these narratives. This has been in part because the global North climate movement's attempt to convince governments for more urgent climate action. However, we call these dangerous narratives because they frame people on the move as a possible threat, which research has shown stokes fear of xenophobia, which in turn can justify more violent responses to migrants and overall completely fails to encourage climate action. So this is why some right-wing politicians, the security establishment, and anti-migrant groups, or far-right groups, are attempting to co-opt and extend this threat framing to climate migration in order to push their agendas. So framing the climate crisis as a national security threat can have unintended consequences, like harsher migration controls, but also can limit civil liberties and democratic freedoms, as previous security narratives have done. So from a policy standpoint, it can shift the climate response into the hands of the security establishment, who heavily rely on the growing border and surveillance industry. So just building what Rosanna said in the previous section, the border as an industry includes companies that are involved in providing immigration detention centers, involved in deportation, involved in border security, and so like militarization of the borders and surveilling borders, so border surveillance, and also companies involved in gathering data on people on the move, which we call kind of like advisory and support companies. So this industry is becoming highly, highly lucrative, increasingly so, and relies on the movement of people for profit. So I've already spoken to the first two communication challenges around climate migration. So communicating scale and urgency, and also how the climate crisis is being co-opted. But the third challenge is around the use of the term climate refugee. So to kind of reiterate what Rosanna said, formal pathways for climate migration are severely underdeveloped. There is no law currently regulating the treatment of climate-linked migration. So while there is a need of legal recognition, refugee advocates have cautioned that renegotiating the refugee treaty will almost definitely result in weaker protections for everyone. So that's something to keep in mind. So just as an example, I want to show this example of how you can change dangerous narratives. So on the left is a tweet from Greta Thunberg. It was one of the highest reaching tweets on climate migration in the last 2 years. And again, you can see this dangerous narrative show up. So in comparison, the tweet on the right, after the dangerous narratives briefs was shared with her, you can see a clear difference in her language and framing, where she provides more context and raises migrant justice. So to sum up, the kind of general points to avoid dangerous narratives are: not use crisis language, not talk about migration as a future threat, and to avoid future projections and instead talk about solutions. So what is our core framing to communicate about climate and migration? So a framework for progressive communications follows the value, villain, and vision structure. So value: humans have always moved. Migration has always been an opportunity for people to build better lives. We need to start by appealing to shared values rather than to the problem. This has shown time and time again to be more effective at shifting public opinion. Villain: so to shift from migrant and refugees being stigmatized and villainized and scapegoated to the real villains of the story: the companies, the CEOs, the banks, the investors, the governments, who are profiting from the hostile environment. So these actors are intentionally stirring up hatred and division, scapegoating people on the move to both push through their hardline policies and also to distract attention from their failures elsewhere. And finally, vision. So for climate justice to equal migrant justice, our vision is the right to stay, for communities to be protected and to thrive despite the impacts of the climate crisis, and the right to move safely and with dignity when it is not possible to stay. So if you want more information on this dangerous narratives, we've created a guide in collaboration with like different migrant and climate justice groups who work in like strategic communications. We're going to take a short break now, but during the break, we're also going to play a little video by Solidarity Knows No Borders Yorkshire, which just shows an example of how climate and migrant justice groups like have worked together.
The world we want to see is a world where there is justice, where everybody has dignity, people enjoy their human rights because they are human beings, a world where solidarity is part of the way people live.
We are communal human beings, social human beings. We need to work alongside other people, get ideas, work together so that we achieve whatever we aim to do. And quite a lot of successes have been gained by working together.
We can push forward and bring about effective change. Our main message is join the union and take ownership of your fights, because we want to be there with you, supporting you. And hopefully through these communities of resistance, we can build bigger support and mutual and reciprocal support.
The immigration system has been designed to be hostile. So people have problems in education, in accessing housing. They live in, poor, rundown housing. And also, they basically cannot live their lives and their rights are taken away.
If your immediate emergency is the climate emergency, join up with people fighting the climate emergency, but don't forget the migrant, don't forget the struggling nurse, don't forget your neighbour next door. It's building work, but with a belief that it can be better.
The societal winds are pushing us towards being broken and being shut off and being siloed and therefore fearing the other. So making sure that we challenge that, not just by doing the actual work of changing the system, but by coming together and living what it truly means to be in community together and in solidarity with each other is absolutely crucial, and it will give us that energy and that joy we need to do the work we need to do.
Coming together right now to build a migrant justice movement is crucial. We need to come together. Humanity is about hope, and hope is with us and will always be with us. Communities don't want to be divided. Neighbors don't want to be divided. You can take action with us by challenging the hostile environment. Check us out, Solidarity Knows No Borders, and sign up and join the movement for migrant justice.
So the video you just saw from Yorkshire is a great example of solidarity between different justice-orientated groups at a community level. And this is something I'm sure you've seen in many different forms in many different places. On the local level, connecting climate and migrant justice means supporting groups and people that are resisting the hostile environment. So we have already seen climate groups coming to action to support to act in solidarity and support those facing border violence in the asylum system. So we have this picture here from XR's big one where there was a protest outside the Home Office, and these little pink paper boats were made by participants that say climate justice is migrant justice, and they were floated on that little moat by the Home Office. On the other side, we have a Just Stop Oil action, no prison ships, where a group of actionists went to try and stop the first coach that was taking people to the Bibi Stockholm barge. So we've already seen some great examples. What was really good about the Just Stop Oil example was that the action takers involved spent a long time talking to migrant justice groups behind the scenes and building trust and taking their input and working with them. And although many of these people weren't able to be publicly associated with the action because of the risk to themselves, they were very much listened to, and their experience was taken into account in the way that the action was designed. So it was a really good example of working in collaboration in a way that worked for everybody. So we can build power across movements by linking the issues in our campaigns and communication. For example, supporting campaigns for meaningful loss and damage funding, which many climate groups have taken up, applies the right to stay principle on the international level. We can be explicit that the climate crisis will hit working class people hardest, and the working class globally is predominantly racialized people. It's not race or class. Stuart Hall told us, race is the modality in which class is lived. So the climate movement has historically been distrusted by migrant groups due to its role in perpetuating harmful narratives and practices that undermine migrant and racial justice. This is changing. Over the last few years, justice is more and more becoming the center of climate organizing. Climate groups are working to decolonize their ways of working, to identify and dismantle cultures of white supremacy. Speaking about this at an event we held last year, Gracie May Bradley said that including racialized people and people with non-citizenship status within your organizations won't magically fix anything, but you can't do decolonial or anti-racist work if your organization isn't somewhere that racialized and marginalized people can flourish. This is the first step towards connecting climate and migrant justice and building meaningful solidarity in a way that is led by those most affected by the issues and centered their voices and experience. One of the most exciting parts of cross-movement organizing is the opportunity to share skills and resources to strengthen our collective power and create meaningful change. We have so much to learn from each other, from successful campaigns and direct action to centering people on the front lines of climate breakdown and hostile borders and developing effective messaging. All over the country, we're seeing groups in the climate and migrant justice movements build and work together to develop trust and act in solidarity. From this cross-movement space, we can build powerful joint campaigns, working together against joint targets. And I'll pass to Rosanna to talk about that on the next slide.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm just going to talk a bit more about this joint targets and finance related to that. Yeah, as we've seen this week, I think it's been the XR Insurance Week of Action. So yeah, there's this kind of way of realizing that we don't need to just be attacking the companies that are creating the climate crisis, but also the financiers of those companies, so banks, investors, and insurers. And yeah, at Tipping Point, we've done research and we've found that surprise, surprise, these same companies, these same banks, investors, and insurers are financing the border regime as well as financing the climate crisis. Yeah, by investing in fossil fuels. So yeah, it would be really interesting to think about how we can join our campaigns together. So if we are attacking a particular insurance company, we can see how this insurance company also is, if we're attacking them because they insure the fossil fuels, we can also attack them for insuring companies in the border regime. So we have done this research. We found that, for example, this is just some of the financiers we found, and we've also got like a lot more. This document is available, but we don't want to share it on a big Zoom call. It would be best if you were interested in finding out, yeah, which of these companies are involved in these two industries. If you put your email in the chat, I think we can email you this research. But I'll just, talk a bit about these ones that are here. So we've got Silchester investors. They invest in Mighty, which is involved in detention centres. They also invest in Total Energies, who are doing the ECOP oil pipeline in East Africa. We've got banks like HSBC who are funding again Mighty again. We've got Shell here, Glencore, Airbus who have done deportation flights, and then the insurance sector. I've got these big insurance companies like Allianz, Aviva, AXA, Chubb. I think Chubb was particularly targeted by XR this week. We can see that they are insuring all these companies like Serco and G4S, which are also involved in detention and deportation flights, and BP, Shell again. This is just some research that we've done that we kind of really want to pass on to climate groups to show you how how you can fight together, how you could maybe create a campaign that involves migrant justice groups, and you can really show how these systems, here you can really see how it's capitalism, how these systems are the root causes of the border regime and the climate crisis, and how so many of these companies are just profiting from so much devastation and destruction. So now it's up to you guys to talk a bit more about this. It would be great if you could go into breakout rooms. I think we're doing like 5 or 6 per breakout rooms. And if you could discuss these questions. So what could you do to connect climate and migrant justice in your community organization? Are there migrant groups in your area that you can connect with? What could you work on together? So please appoint a note taker and a facilitator. We're going to feedback afterwards. Please have more discussions about everything we've talked about. What can you guys do to really link together this climate justice and migrant justice? So I'll give you 15 minutes.
So thank you so much for coming, everyone. It's been so great that you've all been here. So it'd be really good to stay in touch and to use this meeting as a sort of starting point for more kind of intersectional organizing around climate and migrant justice. This is a QR code link to our Signal group. The link is also in the chat. There are also some other links that we're going to share. So one of them is an email lobbying campaign that you can get involved with. It'd be really great to support that so that you can be actively taking action on this, to support people who've experienced border violence. And then another link that we're going to share as well to the Anti-Raids Network. And you can find your local anti-raids group as well. And so there's a list of all the anti-raids groups in the country. So you can join that. And then if there is somebody being deported, hopefully someone should announce that on the group and you can get involved in supporting. We've got some resources as well. And all of this will be shared via email and the Signal chat as well. We really hope that we see you again and that we continue this conversation and this work together. It's so important, and it's been wonderful to share the evening with you. So thanks very much all for coming, and have a great rest of your evening.